I want to give a comment as well on the images and illustrations that my artist in residence has used. We were really, really mindful that actually war is sadly not a new thing. And what we didn't want to do is create images and resources that only spoke to one group of people, or even worse, only spoke to people that looked like me. So all the images that we've used in any of the resources, and I will hopefully share some resources with you shortly, all the resources that we use either reflect different communities, or in this particular presentation is we've used images that could represent anybody, and the idea is it's just people. And that was really important to us, because actually, whilst we're probably quite fresh thinking about the war in Ukraine, we also know that history has been marked with wars for many, many years. For example, the only reason why I'm in this country is because my great grandmother fled the pogroms, and then thereafter my other family members joined after the Second World War. I really want to think about how schools can support children that are displaced by war and conflict. And if you move, I feel like I'm in government, guys. If you move on to the next slide, I've just given a brief introduction to myself, and I'm not going to labour the point at all, because actually what's important is the children that we're going to be talking about. And interestingly, the picture is actually I'm wearing the same top. That wasn't intentional. My background is in sociology and criminology, but also really interested in inclusive education, very broadly speaking. I'm a qualified teacher, and I qualified in citizenship just when citizenship was compulsory. As soon as I qualified, and I'm sure it's got nothing to do with it, citizenship was no longer compulsory within school, which I think is deeply sad. And I'm going to talk about some factors around that, around how do we support children in our communities and how it links to citizenship. I've worked in alternative provision, AP and hospital schools. I think that should probably say 20 years now, but also mainstream school. I say that I'm currently completing a PhD and exploring young people's experiences of accessing AP, but anyone that knows me knows that I've recently had twins and I'm now pregnant again, so that might take a little bit longer. I'm also author of the book Behaving Together, Teacher's Guide to Nurturing Behaviour, in my previous name. So on the next slide, one of the things I noticed when thinking about how do we support children from various different who've kind of experienced war and conflict was actually there wasn't a lot of information out there. You had to really, really hunt for it. And because I've worked in the sector for 20 years, I thought things would have changed and would have been different. So I remember first working in education, said 20 years ago, and it was often children from perhaps Somalia, the Kurdish community, even some children from Cuba who came over to the country for lots of different reasons. And even then I found it difficult to resource and find information, and you would have hoped sort of 20 years further down the line we would have more information. So the first thing I did was have a look at what the key themes in literature were around this topic, because it's incredibly important. And what I found is that there were 6 key themes in this area. One of which was so important was around actually supporting children, was around their confidence in learning and speaking a new language. And what a blessing our position is in the schooling environment, because actually that's what we do, don't we? We teach children and we teach communities, hopefully, to feel safe, nurtured, content, but we teach them language. So we're in a great position. The other key theme is actually that not all children are traumatised, and that's really important as well. So not everyone has the same experience. Some will be, but not all of them will be. The other aspect was, well, how do we promote feelings of belonging? And another key idea, and I suppose I live in Kent, and Kent's quite interesting because living near places like Margate, for example, used to be a kind of key UKIP kind of territory, for example, when UK, I'm not sure if it even exists now, but it was quite different to other bits of Kent, for example, because, and I wonder about how those children experience being welcomed within the schools in the area. But also there was bits around key themes of literature. It's not just about welcoming the children from coming into the schools, but also promoting understanding of those children in the schools and the communities about why people might be displaced in the first place. The idea around civic literacy, the push and pull factors I'm going to talk about as well. The other aspect was developing children's understanding of the country they now live in is very important. And unsurprisingly, we know that relationships are key. So developing relationship with teachers in order to support learning being a key bit. If you could move on to the next slide. I want to start with thinking about this idea of confidence in speaking a language and what that might look like. So to think about this carefully is when we're thinking about schools as a place of refuge, it's through the social support from others. It's unlikely that we will feel safe in isolation on our own, especially when we're surrounded by other people. And whilst we might be initially familiar with the term sanctuary and refuge, when I was doing further reading, there was this idea that schools are caring scapes, which is quite a beautiful phrase, I think, the idea of a place. You might hear the phrase landscape, for example, but actually then being a place where caring occurs. And we know the idea of landscapes is not just the people within it, is it? It's the whole surrounding, it's the whole context. And actually, Caringscapes kind of brought about this idea where social support can be found in the relationships between peers, and it's beneficial for both the health and well-being of those who are refugees or seeking asylum. And Caringscapes can be created by creating spaces which support social communication between children, but also children and staff. And even if we look further than that, children, staff, and the local community. And there's different approaches to be able to utilise this. So you might want to think about notice boards. So often we have notice boards when we walk into a school for the first time, and that might include pictures and names of staff. And what I saw the other day, which I thought was really interesting, a completely different approach, but the idea to bring kind of exploration and curiosity with the children is rather than having pictures of the staff as they are now, but pictures of the staff as they were as children. And then it was the encouragement of, well, see if you can find what teacher looks like that. So it's the idea of excitement as well as learning, curiosity, and building that social connection. But also I wondered if there was also the implicit message of those teachers and staff have been children too. So that's a kind of a different approach around notice boards, but quite a fun way of doing it. But also things like very simple things like having a buddy system where children are paired together to welcome one another. And you might be able to find someone who's fairly responsible in the school environment that really wants to kind of engage with that. But things like setting up conversation clubs to share language knowledge can be really powerful. So not just the child learning English, but maybe other children learning key phrases in their language to be welcoming. Things like keywords being displayed in native languages is really important as well, because what that does is as the child enters that classroom space, they immediately get an idea about what the subject is. So, for example, I worked with one Chinese girl, I think it must have been 20 years ago now, and she spoke no English and had a really traumatic background in having come to England. She didn't speak any English, and I learned how to say, and I'm not going to embarrass myself by putting it on recording. I learned to say, "I am a teacher" in Mandarin, which was her home language. I took the time to find out whether or not it was Mandarin or Cantonese, and it was Mandarin. So I learned how to say, "I am a teacher." So I immediately positioned myself as someone that she could recognise in terms of that learning experience. And then I took her to the classroom, and we were studying about poetry, and it was Benjamin Zephaniah's In the Nature Garden, I think it's called. And I'd written very, very poorly, again, I'm sure, but I'd written the word poetry on the board so she could see what the subject was about, because she was literate in her own language, and that's another thing to kind of factor in. And then in the nature garden, I had pictures connected to the words so she could learn the very kind of concrete nouns for ladybird, tree, garden, and things like that. And that worked really well. But also, there's other kind of interesting ways that you can kind of build up this idea of caringscapes by trying to explore what it means for children directly in that environment. So one approach might be, for example, that I found has worked really well, is giving children cameras. It doesn't have to be expensive cameras or anything like that, and saying, take pictures of places that interest you. And you might need some ways of kind of making sure that's translated for them, so on. I avoided, when I did that piece of work, from take pictures of places you feel safe, because what they did is they took the pictures back and then there was a conversation about places that felt safe, comfortable or unsafe. And it was interesting that there were certain spaces that children felt that they were unsafe in, for example, toilets and so on. But again, that can be a way of exploring kind of the kind of approach around how can we support children that are displaced by war and conflict. Well, find out where they feel safe and find out where they feel unsafe as well. But also it's another opportunity to share language and that rich language skill and all children can do it. It doesn't have to be just those children that are newly arrived to your school. I want us to move on to the next slide, and which is titled "Not All Children Are Traumatized, but some certainly are." So there's aspects around the schooling environment where you can provide universal support. So it's things that you might provide for any children. I'm sure that you're all kind of sitting here and go, of course I want a culture of a school community that's supportive and everyone feels like they belong. But there's some children that might need more help. And we need to kind of have that professional curiosity and knowledge around that and how we might support them. So whilst we might not be assumptive, we are vigilant. So from this perspective, thinking about the idea that actually what you might see is some children might have trouble sleeping. So that might mean that they're quite tired in the mornings. They might lose their concentration. They might find it difficult to get out of bed. They might be late. And that's no surprise for some of the things that they might have seen. And in regards to that, we might see the replaying of events. And when I say replaying, I mean replaying in their head. So it might be, for example, that they have witnessed things that are really scary and frightening. So lots of children that are fleeing from war or conflict have transitioned. They've moved from one place to another, and their journey might have been incredibly difficult. So what does that journey look like for them, and how are they replaying those events? And it might be that there's some experiences that in their kind of journey that feels really reminiscent when they go to particular areas, for example, or if they hear particular noises or even smell different things. And it might be very personal to the individual child around replaying events. So be very aware of that as well. And that the child might, for example, feel distracted, or also they might be what's called hypervigilant. So they might respond to things in quite a dramatic way that you didn't have an appreciation of. And I spoke about earlier, I worked with, and this is basically to kind of acknowledge that I perhaps didn't do things in the way that I ought to have done. Hopefully over the last X amount of years, I've learnt more. But and I'm changing some demographic details of these children in order to kind of maintain their privacy. But working with twin girls that had come from Iraq and they were deaf. So once the war had started, it meant that they didn't have hearing aids. So they didn't speak their own language. They didn't hear their own parents' voices, and so on. But what it had fled war. And what they'd probably done, but I don't know, is there might have been noises and sounds around them that their parents, their mum in particular, had to respond to, that they weren't aware of what was going around. They might have been, picked up and moved from one place to another. They were very young when they came to England. They were about 6 years old. And the fire alarm went off in the school that I was working at. And if I had been more mindful and thoughtful, I would have kind of interpreted that actually this was another time where they were urgently kind of scooped up because they refused to get up and they didn't understand what was around them. But also actually their previous experiences of being scooped up and moved from one place to another was probably fueled with danger and fear. And they responded as if it was fueled with danger and fear. Now, if I was looking back now, I would have gone, I would have done some pictures for them. I would have showed them what a fire alarm, what people might do, where they might line up. I didn't give those children any of that information at all. So there's those bits, they're actually specific triggers relating to war. So in this case, it wasn't the loud noise because they couldn't hear it, but it was the experience being scooped up and moved from one place to another. And difficulty with transitions. Now, I spoke about those children in particular because actually we didn't have an understanding of what that transition looked like. But it might also be having things like difficulty leaving their home environment. So transition from home into school. But also even just going from class to break, because maybe they don't know, is one thing, or maybe they don't have a clear understanding of the rules and routines of the school environment. So those bits are really important to kind of engage and talk to a child about what that looks like as well. And this idea on the next slide, as I said, I feel like I'm in government at the moment, getting everyone to do the next slide for me. Belonging is so important, so important. And again, I was speaking at another presentation this morning around, I spoke about my grandmother's experiences of her mother, had fled the pogroms. She was living in the East End of London, sort of around Commercial Road, Petticoat Lane, like large Jewish community. The war happened. Terrible. Jewish people living in London, knowing that their family were likely to be killed in another country. Sadly, a lot of my family were killed in Auschwitz and other places, but one of them wasn't. It was my cousin Annette, who has since died, and she survived Auschwitz. Her mother, father, sister didn't. And my grandmother spoke about she said, the only language that united us was Yiddish. So they had a sense of belonging there, didn't they? Because actually they could connect through language. So my grandmother's mother spoke Russian, because that's where she was from, Russian heritage, and Yiddish. My grandmother spoke English and Yiddish, and then my cousin Annette spoke French and Yiddish. So the only language that united us is Yiddish. And if you think about promoting feelings of belonging, how do we incorporate that? How do we support that? It's, again, I think we're in a blessed position of being within the school environment, because schools are a key place where we can promote feelings of relatedness, closeness and reciprocity, not just through sharing language and learning together. So remember I said earlier, maybe it's not just about the children learning English, but how do they teach us some of their languages as well? But also schools, at the same time, they can be a massive place that feels isolating and marginalising too. And we have to be really mindful of that, because just because schools might have a culture of belonging, some children may not experience that. And how do we kind of sign into that? Belonging is a key feature of inclusion. And how we understand belonging can be described as a sense of being somewhere where you're confident you can fit in and you can be safe in your identity. And exploring issues around belonging includes experiences that have brought you into a specific place in our global community. Now, I spoke to you just now, free of concern about judgment and so on, about where my family come from. Those people that are displaced from war and conflict might have also been exposed to different situations, to transition, perhaps from one country to another, likely from one place, coming through Europe, for example. But they also might be exposed to feelings of trauma and violence. Understanding how we fit into a community and being reassured in our own identity is really complicated when thinking about our troubling journey to that new community as well, and feelings that we might not be accepted within that community. So the culture and ethos of a school is so important. How do we celebrate the cultures and communities of other people is key. And again, I've put this idea of buddying up. So the idea that one child can support another to really kind of negotiate the school space, introduce them to their friends and so on. But also sharing stories together, I think is really, really powerful. And what I'll do in chat shortly is I will share a resource that I've made, which has all different stories that you can share with one another. But also, if you want to put it in chat and say, actually, I think that these stories really promote other cultures, other communities, or represent my identity, then please share them, because I think stories are so powerful, because the things that you can do with them is that you can build empathy, share ideas. You know, have you ever had that experience that the main character has had? I think is incredibly powerful as well. And the other aspect is around the Tree of Life, which is a narrative tool. The Tree of Life is the idea that you come together as a group, and it's there to enhance feelings of belonging. And it's a collaborative approach where participants are encouraged to create a tree as a metaphor of where they're from and who they are. And it can be The tree of life can be used for stories that are lived but not often told. So, for example, I very rarely say about my grandmother, my great grandmother coming from Russia, for example, but this tree of life explores those kind of issues around identity. The Tree of Life was developed originally from approaches to support children in East and Southern Africa to overcome some of their difficult life experiences. And the Tree of Life activity I think it works probably better in a wider group, but it can be done individually as well. And it evolves around the idea of what does the tree say about that person. And you can look at it in more detail. There's some great YouTube videos about it as well, if you just want something quick and easy to look at. And the roots describe something, leaves are representative of different things, and the idea is you can build a whole tree together of all people and part of that community. It's a lovely visual aspect that you could easily have in the kind of community space. Remember what I said about caring scapes as well, and having that kind of visual imagery around belonging. And the idea is at the end of the process of creating that tree of the roots, the trunk, the leaves, is that participants can explore questions around whether or not they've learned something new about themselves or about others that have been part of that group as well. And it's an exploration of strengths, resilience, and community. So if you move on to the next slide, it's thinking about promoting understanding of why children might be displaced. And this can be really, really difficult because there's a balance there. What we don't want to do is overwhelm children that might really worry and be really, really anxious and might easily frighten about what's happening in different countries, because it becomes quite fearful. So as a parent, for example, or as someone who's teaching other children, be really mindful of that actually balancing that, providing understanding, providing information, but also balancing their worry. So one of the things that I talk about is I will only watch the news at one point during the day. I won't listen to it continually because it becomes overwhelming, unless it was last night and then I was all over the news because obviously it was very exciting, but it didn't feel traumatic to me in the same way that if I just sat and watched about Afghanistan and Ukraine, it's very, very emotionally difficult. So being mindful of how we expose children to those conversations around war as well. So there's a balance there, but also encouraging children to fact check. What information are they receiving in terms of generally children in our school communities, and how can they know it's true? And in the world of social media, actually, we know there's a plethora of information that's shared across various different media channels that may not be as factual as one would like. So it's providing children with that kind of literacy, that kind of digital literacy, and understanding about fact and opinion and how do we find out around sources. That's why history is a really powerful subject as well. And citizenship. I did promise I would talk about my love of citizenship in one way or another. So in developing the school as a refuge, a key component in education is around this idea of civic literacy. So kind of explaining, exploring around what does it mean to be a person in our society. I don't call it British values. And because I'm being recorded, I'm perhaps not going to share my perspective why. But civic literacy can be described as a knowledge that people have to be able to take part in their communities, both locally and nationally. And it can be around the skills required for individuals to understand rights and responsibilities and how also to effectively assert those rights. But also, this is a skill that can be taught to all children, not just those that have been displaced. So whilst we're welcoming children that have been displaced, it's actually about educating our children within schools that maybe have lived in Britain and not had these experiences at all. But also, it's about sharing information around how do those people who come into our country enrich and improve our lives on a daily basis? How do they, and it doesn't have to be the famous people that break world records and anything like that. It's your nurses, it's your bus drivers, it's the people that works in a shop. We all have a part to play in a community, and sharing those experiences and developing that understanding is really important. But there's also bits around that idea of children understanding push and pull factors. So understanding, well, why might children come to England? Why might families come to England? What is so great about it? Or even what is different about their own countries that has basically pushed them out. And I think in certain aspects, it can feel really easy to talk about, doesn't it? Because in terms of Ukraine, for example, we can say, well, there's a war, this is what it looks like, it was quite sudden. Whereas other countries, people might not have the kind of information from the news as often, so they might not appreciate so more. So it might need to be told to them in quite a black and white way around, actually, in this country, girls don't have a right for an education. So that's why they've come to this country. And that can be really important. Or actually, we know that lots of children have, lots of countries might speak English as a second language, and they felt that this was a place to go to. For example, maybe, but obviously nuanced the different situation. But also, role modelling acceptance and understanding is really important. About, again, I having lived in Kent, and if you go to any of the Facebook village groups or anything like that, I mean, acceptance is clearly not being role modelled there. But actually, I think we're in a great position where we see lots of children where we can role model acceptance just by, being kind, being thoughtful to those, welcoming those around us. It starts with us, doesn't it, as educators, I think. Okay. On the next slide, and I'm going to share the link to some of the resources as well. What I've noticed in thinking about how do we welcome children generally within this country is, and how can we support them, is there such little information about how we actually do that. There's lots of teach them English, use key words, but there's not a kind of structure or focus about how we might make that happen. So what I've done, and this is all free to use, is on my website, I've got different resources that you might use for children in a whole range of different environments. And you can see just from the one that says some resources that I have translated them into Farsi, Ukrainian, Turkish and Serbian, I believe, as well as English, some of the welcome to our school packs. And if anybody on this call goes, actually, I speak another language and I'd love to translate for you, please let me know. These are all free for everybody to use. As I said, I will put it in chat in a moment. And it goes through what are some of the kind of key difficulties around attending schools. And actually, school structures in England are very particular to England. I have no idea what goes on in Scotland in terms of their education. If I go to France, I've probably got even less of an idea. If you imagine that you might not have the same structures of an education system within your own country, and then you come to England, it probably looks and feels very, very different. So the Welcome to School Pack is around that orientating. So it's making sure that children know what to expect, know some of the kind of things around how they might enroll on a school. And as I said, it's been translated in different languages. But also things like, well, at secondary school, do you need to bring anything? And it tells you about what you might need to bring as well. And that's really important because it stops children feeling silly and feeling different, because actually they probably feel different enough as it is without going, I'm the only one without a water bottle, or I don't have a PE kit. What even is this subject? It's also the resources, whilst I've created them, need to be very mindful, again, at saying that the education system is very different, that the children and their families may not be literate in their own language as well. So it might be things that are better read out loud to them. But also be mindful that actually some children may have had no experience of education because, for example, they might start later or they might finish early, and a whole range of different things. Or they might have different approaches to school entirely. So being mindful of that is really important. I've also got a resource bank for non-clinical professionals to support children who've escaped from war and conflict. And again, that's really, really important because for refugees and asylum seekers, displaced communities, around 50% of those are children. So you are likely to see children within your school, your further education, your general environments. You're generally likely to see children that might have experienced war and conflict at some point. And you are in a unique and amazing position to be able to support those children within your school environment. And we know, sadly, that things like child and adolescent mental health services or NHS, for lots of different reasons, it might be really difficult to get specialised support. But again, that reiteration, not everyone needs specialised support. Some children may do, but some just need to develop their understanding and being part of that kind of wider community. So there's a lovely resource bank, again, that I will share that you can utilise in any way that you see fit. and feels good for your community. So on the next slide, really, it's just to give you my details, should you want them. And it's got my email address, and that is the website, www.phoenixgrouphq.com. And I think it says stuff I can use. Just click on that and you can download everything. It's all free. It's all for your communities and to make your life easier. So please steal as much as you want. If you want to join me on social networking, I've got my email, I've got my Twitter account address there, Phoenix Ed Sarah. If you want to see less pictures of cats, then you can follow my work one, which is a bit more sensible. And you're also more than welcome to join us for what I call my kids' mental health chat, which I hold fortnightly on Tuesday between 8 and 9 o'clock. So with that, I wonder if anyone has any questions, because I think you're in a great position where you can just shout questions at me. I don't think there's any rules pertaining to that. I mean, Emma might say there are. I might get told off, no. So if anyone wants to kind of ask any questions or have any thoughts, I mean, I've told you that I'm used to working in pupil referral units, not alternative provision. I think you can just unmute yourself and be bosses of your own conversations, or if you feel more comfortable, you can put it in chat. Oh, they're all very gentle, aren't they, Emma? They're all.
They are. I haven't heard the whole session because I've been dipping in and out of other people's. So
there's so many exciting sessions. I want to dip into them as well.
I know there was huge demand for this session, and unfortunately it's transition day as well in Buckinghamshire, which we hadn't foreseen. So I'm really glad it's being recorded, because I know loads of people asked for this session, which is why I contacted you. So yeah, I'll let someone else speak, because I'm sick of my own voice.
I think they're all shy.
I'm guessing you've talked about trauma and the impact of trauma on the young people coming in, because I know there are a lot of teachers feeling really overwhelmed, and they're delighted to welcome these young people, but are feeling just what's the word? They don't have the tools to handle the level of trauma, and actually that's manifesting itself in some quite challenging behaviour as well from day one.
I think that can be really difficult. Yeah, so we spoke about that not all children are traumatised, but some are. And we are likely to see them as educators within our school environments. We spoke about the idea of trouble sleeping, the replaying of events, but also that hypervigilance of kind of looking out for things that might occur. And I spoke about some twin girls that I worked with who were deaf and came from Iraq, and the fire alarm went off and they couldn't hear it, and they were scooped up and taken to another space. But actually, that was probably, looking back, how incredibly traumatic that was for them, because they were probably used to being scooped up and really horrible things were happening around them. And it's only now, being, I'll say older and wiser, but I think it's just experience. I hadn't thought of it. And if I had a thought of it, I would have prepared for that. And the idea that actually specific triggers they are specific, relating to war. So it's not just random. We do things like fireworks can be a trigger, for example, so being mindful of that. One thing that I haven't spoken about, which is really important actually, is I speak about the idea that actually that guilt of leaving others behind. So you might be in this country and you might be safe, but what about the others that you worry about? You might not have as much contact as you did before. So again, I spoke about my grandmother saying the only language that united us was Yiddish. And then she went through, she had the Second World War. She knew that her family lived in France, in Poland, and what that meant, and kind of that acknowledgement that actually only one person survived. I can't imagine the guilt that she must have felt, and the worry, because not being able to contact people and so on. And I'm lucky enough to have, I've got letters that my granddad wrote to his brother in South Africa who was fighting in the Second World War, and again being Jewish. And it's really interesting reading those letters that my grandfather received, asking him to come into the other. Sorry, I switched off there, didn't I? Sorry, it's really interesting reading the letters about trying to get him to come to South Africa, and how my granddad must have felt receiving those letters. And so we forget that the children in our countries might be physically safe, but actually they might still have so many worries about others. And the other thing that I didn't talk about is that some children still don't actually have a safe space, because they might live in places like displacement hotels where they can't cook together as a family. They live in one room, food is given to them. They don't have access to benefits, or whatever the Daily Mail tells you in terms of recourse to funds. That our Ukrainian families have access to some of those things. They often live with families and often have access to making their own food. But how about the Afghani children that don't? So we have to be mindful of those, and how they might not have a quiet place to do their work because they live in one room with their family. I'm really blessed to be able to just invite people. My daughter is to invite people to our house. If you live in a displacement hotel, you can't do that. So how do you kind of incorporate making friends and being part of that community? And I think that all builds into people's idea of belonging and self-worth.
Brilliant. You may have covered it, but say you're a teacher and probably at very short notice someone arrives at your door with a new child who's come from a war zone. What would be the first things you would recommend they do as a teacher? What are the priorities?
Liaise with the family. Don't assume you know what language that they speak either. So Afghan, it could be Pashto, it could be Farsi, Chinese, it could be Mandarin, it could be Cantonese, or they might just speak perfect English. Find out. Ukrainian, Russian, it could be anything. So find out. So liaise with the family. Find out if they're literate in their own language. Introduce yourself. So one of the things that I spoke about with a child is I learned how to say Mandarin, and I said I wasn't going to embarrass myself. You're not going to trick me, Emma. I'm not going to. I learned how to say I'm a teacher in Mandarin.
Oh, go on.
No, because teacher and rat sound really similar, so I don't want to get it wrong. Really similar, and then people might play this back and be like, "Oh my goodness, she doesn't know what she's talking about." So I'm not going to buy into it. But situating myself. This is my role, and this is what I do. I teach. So liaise with family. Introduce who you are and what you do, and then things like key facts. What time are you meant to be at the school? What uniform do you wear? And making sure they have that available. And one thing I didn't speak about this is be professionally curious. I have a great job where I work with the local authority around supporting children being admitted into school. And I'd sorted out a school for a child, but the parent was saying, you live too far away. It was a 15-minute walk. And I thought, and I sort of checked, well, are they disabled? Like, no. And what it was is they only had sandals. And to walk 15 to 20 minutes in sandals in British winter, oh my goodness, I wouldn't want to do that either. And actually, I didn't know. And it was only because I was like, what's going on here? What does this mean? Why are they not taking this child to school? And my head jumped onto, maybe they don't value education. That wasn't the case at all. Absolutely valued education. I had just made an assumption about the access to resources they had. And in being in a displacement hotel, sandals in winter might be okay. Taking your kid to school in the city of London, not so much. So professional curiosity, I think, is really important as well. And if you can, find out if that child has learning difficulties or special educational needs. So I've had the experience of very traumatized deaf children, twins, coming into my school, having no idea about their experience, that they were deaf or anything, and see if you can link them up to the relevant agencies. So I think those are some of the quick wins you can do, but also very simple things. Sign for toilet, things like that. Like make sure they know where the toilets are and make sure they can use the loo, because it's really important that they know that really basic information that they might not have awareness of. So
the key thing is assume nothing.
Assume nothing, be professionally curious.
Brilliant.
So if no one has any questions, you've all been ever so polite. And thank you for dealing with the fact that I'm doing this on my mobile phone because my computer refused to work. And I look forward to hopefully being able to jump into a few more sessions later.